When Adolf Hitler was released from Landsberg prison in December 1924, Germany was a humiliated nation, economically suffocated and morally fractured. The Weimar Republic barely maintained its authority amid communist uprisings, hyperinflation, and a quietly simmering national resentment. Millions of Germans struggled between poverty and uncertainty, convinced that the Treaty of Versailles had turned their country into an international outcast. Amid that chaos, not just a politician emerged, but a figure many would come to see as a savior. Hitler presented himself not as an ordinary man, but as the bearer of a historical mission. The masses observed him not from afar, but with fervent devotion, almost religious in nature. His words became promises, his image a symbol, his voice a certainty. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, once a marginal movement, transformed into an unstoppable engine of propaganda, mobilization, and collective faith. Unlike other parties, it did not appeal to rational economic arguments but to the repressed emotions of the people. Hitler offered not merely jobs or stability, but the restoration of German pride. For a humiliated populace, battered by mass unemployment and the collapse of the mark, hearing that Germany would rise again was not a political pledge, it was spiritual redemption. Nazi rallies were not merely political gatherings but orchestrated ceremonies. Red flags waved like sacred banners, torches illuminated the night, and speeches were delivered as sermons. In Nuremberg, Hitler's appearances produced a collective effect. Men and women wept, raised their arms, and swore eternal allegiance to a figure they no longer viewed as a temporary leader but as a historical emissary. Past defeats were reframed through the Führer's rhetoric as cosmic injustices demanding rectification. The fall of the German Empire, territorial losses, reparations, and international sanctions were woven into an epic narrative in which Germany was a victim, not a culprit. Hitler offered a narrative where Germans were not responsible for their suffering but pawns of external conspiracies and internal betrayals. Within this story, every German felt part of an outraged community called to rise and reclaim its honor. Politics became myth. Through radio, cinema, and controlled newspapers, Hitler's presence multiplied until he was everywhere: public offices, schools, factories, and living rooms. His image presided over school ceremonies, and children learned to speak his name with reverence. For many, especially youth growing up under the regime, Hitler was not an elected official but the living embodiment of the nation. The crowds followed him not out of duty, but conviction. The Great Depression of 1929 acted as a catalyst. While millions faced unemployment and bank closures, Hitler traveled the country promising order. While others proposed economic solutions, he promised destiny. When appointed chancellor on January 30, 1933, he did not ascend as a typical politician but as the leader of a people seeking their lost identity. The torches illuminating the Brandenburg Gate that night marked not a cabinet change but the beginning of an era many Germans believed providential. Under the guise of legality, the transformation of the state commenced. The Reichstag fire, blamed on communist conspirators, provided the pretext to suspend constitutional freedoms and grant Hitler extraordinary powers. The public, far from resisting, applauded these measures. They perceived them not as a loss of liberties but as a necessary purge to eliminate the nation's enemies. The promise of unity and racial purity penetrated the collective mind, not as coercion but as moral aspiration. Millions of Germans, convinced they were part of a historical rebirth, willingly surrendered their freedom in exchange for belonging to something they believed eternal. Nazi propaganda did more than manipulate information, it created a worldview. Every film, poster, and speech framed Germans as part of a mystical national body. The Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, promised to transcend class, religious, and regional divisions into a unified racial organism. It was not merely a political ideology but a sense of collective belonging. Workers, peasants, teachers, priests, and soldiers shared the vision that their lives were subordinate to a higher purpose, the greatness of the Reich. In this new reality, Hitler was not an administrator but the spiritual guide of a people in motion. His word carried the weight of law, his will expressed the essence of Germany. Citizens did not obey orders, they obeyed their national conscience personified in one man. Millions came to believe that disobeying the Führer was betraying the homeland, and that serving him was serving Germany itself. The ideological transformation was total. It was not only about controlling the media but shaping minds. The regime understood that true domination requires internal conviction, not just bayonets or prisons. While the SA paraded through the streets and the Gestapo lurked in the shadows, millions felt pride in belonging to something transcending themselves. Every sacrifice seemed justified, every anti-Jewish law necessary, every territorial expansion celebrated as historic right. By the mid-1930s, as Germany revived its economy, reduced unemployment, and openly challenged the Versailles Treaty, fervor had become national euphoria. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936 was seen by Germans not merely as a strategic act, but as an act of justice. The masses listened to Hitler's voice broadcast over public loudspeakers, and many cried with joy, convinced they were witnessing the rebirth of their nation. The plebiscites that legitimized the Führer's decisions were not a farce for the voters. They were acts of faith. National Socialism became the religion of the 20th century for millions of Germans. Hitler promised not only prosperity but historical transcendence. He offered not policies but destiny. He asked not for votes but for absolute loyalty. For many Germans, Hitler's rise to power was not a coup or a political accident but the fulfillment of something long awaited. And in that moment, in that instant, when the lights of the Nuremberg Stadium came on and the Führer appeared before the masses, millions of German citizens sincerely believed that their history had begun anew, the propaganda machinery of the Third Reich. When Joseph Goebbels assumed the Ministry of Propaganda and Public Enlightenment in 1933, Germany ceased to be an informed nation and became a molded nation. It was not just about controlling the media, but about transforming the perception of reality. Goebbels did not see propaganda as just another political tool, but as a total weapon intended to penetrate every corner of German life. For him, cinema, radio, newspapers, children's books, and even everyday conversations were to act as extensions of the same voice, that of the Führer. Within a year, formational plurality was eliminated. Independent publishers disappeared, newspapers were bought or closed, and journalists had to swear loyalty to the regime. Truth ceased to be a fact and became a design. Radio was a central instrument. Goebbels understood that it was not enough to broadcast speeches. Hitler's voice had to reach every home. To this end, he promoted the mass production of the Volksempfänger, a low-cost radio subsidized by the state. Millions of families obtained one, making it a common object in the German living room. Radios could not easily tune into foreign stations. They were mainly designed to receive official broadcasts. When Hitler spoke, the streets stood still. Factories stopped their machines. Schools interrupted classes. Passers-by gathered around public loudspeakers. At that moment, no isolated individuals existed. Everyone was a single audience under a single voice. Cinema was the most powerful emotional tool. Goebbels controlled the UFA studios and turned film production into a psychological engineering apparatus. Films such as Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will were not mere documentaries, but carefully designed spectacles to glorify Hitler as the center of the German universe. Aerial shots, meticulously choreographed parades, hundreds of waving flags, thousands of arms raised in unison, all aimed to create a collective feeling of mystical belonging. The viewer was not invited to reflect but to absorb. Every scene was loaded with symbols evoking power, order, and historical destiny. The Führer was not presented as a politician, but as the embodiment of the German soul. The written press was purged from the start. Jewish newspapers were closed. Editors not affiliated with the party were arrested or forced to resign. International news was filtered by the state, not with the intention of informing, but of creating enemies and heroes. When Germany remilitarized the Rhineland, newspapers did not headline an illegal act under international treaties, but the courage of Germans in reclaiming their honor. Every word was loaded with intent. Goebbels did not seek to convince through reason, but through emotion. He knew the reader was not meant to analyze, but to feel pride, outrage, hope, or fear. Objectivity was replaced by the epic narrative of national redemption. The education system was reorganized so propaganda would not only shape the present but mold the future. Teachers were forced to join the National Socialist Teachers League. Textbooks were rewritten to glorify the Germanic past, demonize the enemy, and present Hitler as the fulfillment of the German destiny. Children learned history not as a sequence of events, but as spiritual preparation for struggle. Biology became racial pseudoscience. Geography became expansionist propaganda. In classrooms, children were not taught to think, but to obey. From an early age, the German child was educated to belong before to exist. Propaganda did not limit itself to traditional media. It penetrated everyday life. In trains, posters announced, "He is guilty, the Jew." In cinemas before each film, newsreels showed Hitler greeting crowds while emitting concentration camps. In stores, shop windows displayed anti-Semitic slogans. In religious celebrations, pastors aligned with the regime preached that Hitler had been sent by Providence. Political rituals were transformed into national festivities. Hitler's birthday was celebrated as the day of German rebirth. Initiation ceremonies in the Hitler Youth reproduced pagan and Christian liturgies, merging the sacred and political into a single act of faith. Through cinema and radio, Goebbels not only exalted the Führer, but created the absolute enemy. Screenings of The Eternal Jew portrayed Jews as parasites, as a biological threat. The words usury, degeneration, and conspiracy were repeated constantly until they were embedded in the population's mind. It was not an opinion. It was a revealed truth. The enemy ceased to be an individual and became an abstract, omnipresent entity responsible for all ills. In this way, any action of the regime against that enemy was perceived as just. Large public gatherings were designed to provoke a total sensory experience. Hitler was not only heard, he was experienced. Torches burned as if they were eternal symbols. Red banners with the swastika hung over colossal buildings. The monumental architecture, designed by Albert Speer, served as a symbolic stage for the German rebirth. Every stone, every column, every light was designed to convey the sense that Germany was not a country but a mission. The mass gathered in perfect synchrony, merged into a single will. When Hitler appeared, silence became absolute before exploding into a unanimous roar. In that moment, the individual ceased to exist. Only the people and their Führer remained. Propaganda also penetrated the private sphere. Soldiers' letters were checked to ensure there was no discontent. Broadcasts transmitted stories of proud mothers sending their sons to the front as if offering a sacred sacrifice. Radios played patriotic songs that glorified heroic death. Goebbels understood that total control required not only directing what Germans heard, but also what they thought in the intimacy of their homes. Even jokes against the regime could be punished as treason. Propaganda was not only based on repeating favorable messages, but also on silencing any doubt. As the 1930s progressed, the propaganda machinery achieved its goal, not only to convince, but to replace reality. When Hitler announced the annexation of Austria in 1938, millions of Germans celebrated it as if they had regained a part of their own body. The streets were flooded with flowers, balconies were covered with flags, and the radio broadcast the event as if it were the coronation of an emperor. The people did not see invasions, but unification. They did not see aggression, but historical justice. propaganda had succeeded in making Hitler's will perceived as their own. At that point, Goebbels had accomplished what no information minister in modern history had achieved: transforming an entire country into an ideological stage, where every word, every image, and every silence served a single purpose. It was not about hiding the truth, but completely replacing it. For millions of Germans, propaganda was not perceived as manipulation, but as revelation. Hitler did not speak to convince but to confirm what the people already felt, that they were special chosen and that their destiny was written in world history. Faith in the Führer. For millions of Germans, Adolf Hitler was not simply a politician, not even a national leader. He was the embodiment of a collective destiny. He was admired not as a statesman but as a providential figure. To understand how a cultured people with philosophers, composers, and world-renowned scientists placed their will in the hands of a single individual, it is necessary to understand that the phenomenon of the Führer was not built solely on speeches, but on a deep emotional need to belong to something higher. Germany after its defeat in World War I was perceived as a wounded, betrayed and humiliated nation. Hitler appeared not as a ruler offering temporary solutions but as a messiah promising historical redemption. From his first speeches, Hitler did not speak of himself as an individual but as the voice of the German people. He constantly repeated that he had no personal ambitions, that his life was worthless if not in the service of the nation. This apparent renunciation of the personal gave him an aura of sacrifice. People did not see ambition. They saw devotion. For many, Hitler was not a leader demanding obedience. He was an instrument of destiny demanding loyalty. Thus, the concept of the Führerprinzip, the principle of absolute leadership, was born, where the leader embodied the will of the people and was therefore infallible. Within this framework, questioning Hitler was not a political critique, but a betrayal of Germany itself. Propaganda carefully built his image as a simple, austere man devoted exclusively to the welfare of the people. Newspapers reported that he had no vices, did not smoke, did not drink alcohol, and led a disciplined life. His vegetarianism for moral reasons was emphasized, as if his personal purity reflected the purity of the destiny guiding him. Hitler was never presented as part of the traditional elites, but as a man of the people rising from adversity. This narrative resonated deeply with the working class and peasants, sectors that began to feel he represented their dreams. When he traveled in an open car and greeted the crowds, one did not see a protected ruler. One saw someone who trusted his own people. Hitler gave Germans an emotional identity, that of being chosen for a historical mission. His speeches did not appeal to reason, but to pride. To every national problem, he offered a promise of greatness. To every foreign affront, he responded with defiance. His rhetoric transformed resentment into spiritual strength. He did not speak of Germans as victims but as bearers of a destiny. This generated a psychological phenomenon. Every success of the regime was interpreted not as the result of political decisions but as tangible proof that Hitler had been sent by Providence. The great acts of the party were carefully orchestrated rituals to intensify this faith. In Nuremberg, Hitler descended monumentally down staircases flanked by banners and torches while the crowd watched in reverent silence before erupting in unanimous acclaim. These events were not designed to inform, but to provoke a collective emotional experience. Many attendees described crying upon seeing him, convinced they were witnessing the rebirth of their nation. The images of thousands of arms raised simultaneously did not reflect oppression, but devotion. The masses did not feel they were obeying Hitler, but merging with him. The consolidation of this bond was reinforced through everyday symbolic gestures. They photographed Hitler caressing children, visiting factories, Greeting wounded soldiers. Propaganda portrayed him as a protective father, as a moral guide. In German homes, his portrait was placed in places of honor, sometimes alongside religious symbols. Many Germans prayed for him. Sermons from Protestant pastors and Catholic priests aligned with the regime proclaimed that Hitler had been sent by God to restore German greatness. There was talk of political miracles and national resurrection. In that spiritualized context, politics ceased to be a rational exercise and became an act of faith. Even the regime's architecture contributed to this phenomenon. Buildings designed by Albert Speer were meant to convey eternal power. The monumental scale, gigantic columns, and open spaces for crowds were not mere aesthetic whims. They were designed to make each individual feel part of something immense. When Hitler walked through those spaces, his figure was symbolically enlarged. He did not walk among human structures, but among temples of the new order. Every stone spoke of permanence, of transcendence. His mere presence in those settings evoked the idea that he was the architect of a new civilization. Surveys and testimonies of the time reflect an extraordinary phenomenon. Millions of Germans claim to feel that Hitler understood them personally. It did not matter that they had never seen him in person. His voice transmitted over the radio entered their homes. His image projected in cinemas became familiar. When he spoke, he seemed to address each citizen directly. He said, "You and we," as if sharing their pains and aspirations. This psychological effect multiplied by propaganda created a direct emotional bond with the Führer. A bond that replaced trust in the state with faith in a single person. The military oath was one of the strongest mechanisms of this cult. From 1934, German soldiers swore loyalty not to the Constitution or the fatherland, but directly to Adolf Hitler. It was a personal oath pronounced on their knees with a hand on the flag. It was not about obeying military orders, but serving the Führer with their lives. This legal transformation made faith in Hitler a moral duty. Millions of soldiers sincerely believed that dying for him was dying for Germany. The cult of his figure penetrated even private life. Popular songs mentioned his name as if it were a symbol of hope. Mothers taught their children to pronounce Führer before many other words. In schools, children did not stand to greet the teacher, but to swear allegiance to Hitler. At party celebrations, the silence before his appearance was perceived as a sacred moment. Everyday time was divided into before and after his rise to power. Hitler understood this phenomenon better than anyone. In his speeches, he spoke of his calling, of his mission. He never said he had decided to govern. He said fate had chosen him. In this way, he did not present his actions as human decisions, but as historical inevitabilities, a manifest destiny predetermined by the epic of human progress. Germans, by accepting this, did not feel like followers of a man, but participants in a unique historical era. They were convinced the world had entered a new time and that Hitler was its axis. When the war began, this faith reached its peak intensity. The swift victories over Poland, France, Belgium, Norway, and the Netherlands were celebrated not only as military triumphs, but as spiritual confirmations. Crowds went out into the streets not to celebrate the army, but the Führer. When Hitler appeared on balconies, people wept with emotion. They believed they were witnessing the fulfillment of German destiny that had been denied for centuries. The illusion of unity and purity. The concept of Volksgemeinschaft for the National Socialist regime. Germany was not just a nation. It was a living organic body, composed of millions of human cells united by the same blood and the same destiny. This idea was synthesized in a term that transcended the political to become an emotional identity. Volksschaft, the community of the people. It was not an administrative concept but a spiritual revelation that promised to transcend class, religious or regional divisions into a single racial community. In that ideal, every German was part of a higher whole, a historical mission. Propaganda not only spread this concept, it turned it into an everyday feeling that penetrated factories, schools, homes, and fields. Newspapers published stories intended to move the people like the following. In an agricultural village in Bavaria, a farmer with the fictional name Franz Müller attended local party meetings not out of obligation but out of conviction. Before the regime, he felt abandoned by the Weimar Republic, a victim of unfair taxes and an unstable market. Now the state gave him subsidies, bought his crops, and told him he was the heart of Germany. When he looked up and saw the red banners waving in front of the town hall, he did not see political symbols. He saw proof that he, an ordinary man, was part of a chosen community. The Volksschaft turned rural life into a patriotic act, and propaganda really took effect across the nation, especially among those struggling economically and disillusioned with the past. In industrial cities, the factory worker felt similarly transformed. For decades, class struggle had divided Germany between socialists, conservatives, liberals, and communists. The regime promised to remove these barriers. Workers were offered social programs, paid vacations, sports activities, and access to concerts and theaters through the organization Strength Through Joy. Suddenly, the worker who had previously seen the state as distant now perceived it as a companion. He was not fighting to improve his wages. He was fighting to strengthen the community. Receiving a subsidized Volkswagen car or participating in a Baltic cruise. He felt not only material well-being but national dignity. The illusion of unity was also experienced in homes. German housewives received medals for having many children as if each birth were a sacred act for the people. The mutates the cross of the German mother was awarded in solemn ceremonies proclaiming that giving birth to Aryan children was a transcendent service. In towns and cities, mothers marched with their awards, proud to be recognized not as individuals, but as pillars of the nation. The home was no longer a private space. It was a sanctuary for the future of the Reich. In schools, teachers instructed children not as students, but as future guardians of the community. History taught that the ancient Germans were a warrior people destined to rule. Biology transformed into racial doctrine. The child heard that their blood connected them to a lineage that had to be kept pure. Mathematics included problems calculating the cost of maintaining unproductive people, implying that the community should rid itself of weak elements. In the classroom, citizens were not built, but cells of a collective organism. For the youth, the Volkmannschaft was an experience of emotional fervor. In the Hitler Youth, any boy learned that camaraderie was not friendship, but racial brotherhood. During summer camps, surrounded by campfires and flags, he swore to serve the people with his body and soul. When he sang Reich songs at dawn with his arm raised, he felt his individual life dissolve into the strength of millions. He was part of something eternal. Youth stopped imagining their future as a personal trajectory. Their destiny was the destiny of the people. The concept of unity also transformed social relationships. Religious traditions, regional dialect differences, or historical rivalries between states were subordinated to the ideal of the racial community. A Protestant from Prussia and a Catholic from Bavaria no longer saw themselves as members of separate identities, but as brothers under the same destiny. The greeting Hi Hitler replaced traditional greetings not only as a gesture of loyalty but as a symbol that the person being greeted was part of the same spiritual entity. The Volksgemeinschaft promised to abolish individual selfishness. Private property continued to exist, but it was morally subordinated to the good of the people. Personal decisions such as marriage or profession were seen as contributions to the collective destiny. The regime exalted the idea of sacrifice. A businessman who gave up profits in favor of military production was celebrated as a hero just as much as a soldier. A farmer who delivered his harvest to the state was not paying taxes. He was feeding the blood of the Reich. This ideal of purity was not symbolic. It had legal and biological consequences. The community of the people was defined by blood, not citizenship. Jews, the disabled, Roma, and other groups were systematically excluded. They were not expelled from the country immediately, but first from the emotional community. Signs saying Jews not allowed were not presented as prohibitions, but as measures of national hygiene. In the minds of many citizens, exclusion was not seen as injustice, but as purification. They were made to believe that the community had to be clean to remain strong. One of the most powerful aspects of the Volksgemeinschaft was its ability to transform fear into cohesion. During the years of the regime, the Gestapo monitored the population. But many Germans did not perceive this surveillance as oppression, but as protection of the national body. Neighbors reported on neighbors not out of personal hatred, but because they believed they were expelling an infection from the organism. Social control was intense, yet it was not perceived as state surveillance, but as an act of loyalty to the people. The illusion of unity also offered material benefits. Germans experienced an improvement in the economy, saw roads being built, regained jobs, and watched as their country regained international prestige. The regime's narrative linked these achievements directly to the strength of the racial community. "We are strong because we are one" was repeated in speeches, songs, and ceremonies. Thus, prosperity was not attributed to individual work or economic measures but to the purity of the national body. But the Volksschaft was not just a political ideal. It was a lived feeling. When the Olympic Games opened in Berlin in 1936, the streets were filled with flags. Citizens did not feel like spectators of a sporting event, but as witnesses to Germany's return to the world stage. Each winning athlete was not seen as an individual, but as a symbol of the race. The people saw themselves reflected in each victory. The collective emotion was not nationalist euphoria. It was an identity trance. In the late 1930s, millions of Germans were convinced they lived in a perfect community. They saw no social divisions, felt no internal conflicts. They believed they had freed themselves from democratic chaos and class struggle. Poverty decreased. Roads expanded. Speeches spoke of glory. Reality was shaped to confirm the myth. The German people were no longer a collection of citizens. They were a single body, a single will, a single blood, marching toward a destiny from which no one wanted to be excluded. The vision of the enemy. 4 millions of Germans to become not only witnesses, but passive or even active participants in the most destructive project of the 20th century. It was necessary to shape their perception of the enemy until they were stripped of humanity. The Nazi regime did not limit itself to identifying political opponents. It built a worldview in which the enemy was an unnatural being, a dark force, an existential threat to the survival of the German people. Goebbels understood that if he managed to turn the ideological struggle into an absolute moral battle, the people would not merely accept violence, but would see it as necessary to protect their own existence. From the very beginning, the regime established a hierarchy of enemies. At the top were the Jews, portrayed not as individuals, but as a parasitic race operating in the shadows to corrupt nations. This portrayal did not arise from nothing. It was fed by old prejudices reinforced by caricatures, pamphlets, schoolbooks, and films that depicted Jews as physically deformed, morally degenerate, and biologically dangerous. In contemporary diaries, a Hamburg merchant noted that his neighbors began to speak of Jews not as people with names, but as them, an abstract entity to be protected against. Language changed before politics. People stopped speaking of Jewish citizens and began speaking of the Jewish threat. In schools, teachers used maps to show how, according to propaganda, Jews controlled the financial world. 10-year-old children learned that Germany had been internally betrayed during World War I by Jewish and Marxist elements who allegedly sabotaged the front within. Biology lessons included exercises comparing the supposed Aryan purity with Jewish degeneration. The German child did not receive information but a moral framework. The Jew was not simply different. He was dangerous. The same mechanism applied to other groups. Communists were presented as agents of worldwide chaos whose goal was to destroy Western civilization. The British were portrayed as hypocrites who spoke of freedom while exploiting entire colonies. The Soviets were shown as barbaric, inhuman hordes ready to invade Europe. Yet all these enemies were presented as instruments of a greater plan orchestrated by the international Jewish conspiracy. Propaganda thus established a simple totalizing narrative. Germany was not fighting for territory or power, but for its own moral and biological survival. In cinemas, films like The Eternal Jew showed scenes of crowded markets where Jewish actors were depicted as dirty and greedy, while images of rats running through garbage were overlaid to create a subconscious association. In weekly news reels, the face of the Jew was the face of danger. Families attending these screenings did not see fiction. They saw official truth. When they left the cinema and returned home, they no longer encountered a Jewish neighbor, but the embodiment of the enemy. On the radio, gerbils gave speeches presenting every international event as aggression against Germany. If a country criticized the Nazi regime, announcers explained that it was because Germany was exposing the hidden power of Jews abroad. International public opinion was seen not as politics, but as conspiracy. Every critique was interpreted as confirmation that the enemy feared Germany's resurgence. In bakeries, in markets, in tramcars, everyday conversations began to fill with phrases that did not come from personal experience, but from official discourse. During the pogroms of 1938, known as the Night of Broken Glass, many citizens did not participate in the violence, but neither did they intervene. The broken windows, the burned synagogues, and the looted businesses did not generate compassion, but a strange sense of restored justice. The crowds watched in silence, convinced that the community was being purified of a latent threat. The enemy was not only the visible Jew, but also the infiltrator, the saboteur, the one pretending to be German while destroying from within. This idea created an atmosphere of constant social surveillance. In a small town in the Rhineland, a teacher reported one of her colleagues for making ironic comments about Hitler. She did not act out of personal hatred, but out of conviction. She believed she was defending the community from the danger of doubt. The enemy was no longer someone on the front, but someone in the classroom and the corner shop on the park bench. This collective paranoia bonded the town through shared fear. During the war, this vision of the enemy reached apocalyptic proportions. The Soviets were portrayed as subhuman beings capable of indescribable atrocities. The media reported dramatically on alleged crimes committed by Red Army soldiers to generate psychological terror. In the Diary of a German Soldier on the Eastern Front, it reads, "I do not see them as men. If we do not stop them, they will kill our women and children. I do not fight for Hitler. I fight so that Germany does not disappear."
This sentence summarizes the success of the regime.
The enemy was confronted not for ideology but for survival.
On the home front, propaganda explained every defeat as the result of betrayal or conspiracy. When Allied bombs devastated cities like Hamburg and Dresden, many Germans did not blame the Reich's military strategy, but the supposed evil of the enemy. The ruins did not generate rejection of the war, but affirmation that the struggle was against dark forces bent on destroying Germany. The mothers who lost their children in the bombings did not curse the regime. They swore that the sacrifices would be avenged. The regime reinforced this mentality with concrete laws and policies. The Nuremberg racial laws were presented not as oppression but as defense of the people. Mass deportations were hidden behind euphemisms such as resettlement to the east. In many towns, when Jews disappeared, citizens assumed they had been sent to work for the war effort. They did not need proof. Moral certainty instilled over years was enough to believe the enemy had to be neutralized. The vision of the enemy became the psychological axis of the regime. It no longer mattered whether a German was fully convinced of Nazism. It was enough that he believed in the danger. Fear united the nation as much as pride did. And as long as the enemy existed, the community considered itself morally obliged to fight. Every poster, every speech, every film reinforced the same idea. Germany was not conquering. It was defending. It was not exterminating. It was protecting itself. It did not act out of hatred. It acted out of duty. Everyday life under the Third Reich. For most German citizens, life under the Third Reich was not perceived as a dictatorship, but as a national rebirth. The regime offered employment, stability, and a sense of belonging that had vanished after World War I and the chaotic years of the Weimar Republic. As swastika flags hung from every building, parades filled the streets, and radios broadcast speeches praising the Führer's achievements. Millions of Germans began to experience a dual reality, an everyday life of order and apparent prosperity, and at the same time a constant shadow of surveillance, silence, and fear of the invisible. Using a real testimony as an example, a metallurgical worker named Ernst left his house in the city of Leipzig every morning proud to wear the uniform of the German Labor Front. Before the Nazi regime, he had been unemployed with his family on the brink of misery. Now he not only had stable work but also participated in state-organized social activities. He received theater tickets, excursion passes, and the opportunity to buy a Volkswagen in minimal installments. He felt that the state cared about him. Every time he passed a poster of the Führer, he looked up with genuine acknowledgement. For Ernst, the dictatorship did not appear as oppression, but as shared prosperity, and this was not a unique case. German soldiers crossed rivers and fields convinced that they were repairing the world. Letters from the front reviewed by military censorship reflected this perception. A corporal wrote, "I do not fight for myself. I fight for all who will come after. Every step we take is to secure Germany's future." Patriotic duty did not arise from coercion, but from a moral conviction instilled from childhood. In cities, the war effort was experienced as a shared mission. Factories operated day and night. Posters proclaimed, "Every screw was a shot against the enemy." Women entered industry with the same fervor as soldiers at the front. Housewives handed in copper pots to be melted into ammunition. Children collected metal and paper for the army. Every everyday act was imbued with patriotic meaning. Civil life ceased to be civil. It became an extension of the front. Soldiers, for their part, experienced the war as a blend of camaraderie and transcendence. In the first months, units advanced rapidly,
receiving letters of admiration from
their hometowns. In their backpacks, many carried mine as a spiritual text.
During nights in the camps, they spoke of expanding the living space of the German people, of securing land and
resources for future generations. Young people did not dream of returning soon to resume their lives.
They dreamed of leaving their name engraved in the history of the Reich.
Propaganda reinforced this view. Newsreels showed soldiers crossing European cities under the cheers of the population, hiding any resistance. Newspapers published
photographs of soldiers sharing bread with blonde children in newly occupied villages, presenting the war as a
civilizing act. Even bombings were celebrated as surgical strikes against enemies of the people.
Every victory was attributed to faith in the Führer and the spiritual strength of the community of
the people. As the campaigns extended eastward, the war took on an absolute ideological tone. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 was presented as a crusade against Bolshevism.
Soldiers received pamphlets explaining that they were not facing an army, but an inhuman
horde determined to destroy Europe.
The German soldier saw himself as a barrier between civilization and barbarism. In personal diaries, many wrote that they were not fighting for their own lives, but for the survival of the continent.
Meanwhile, at home, the war continued to be narrated as a shared duty. Women
received letters notifying them of the death of their husbands, accompanied by diplomas signed by Hitler that said, "Your husband gave his life so that Germany may live." Mothers hung these notices in the main living room, not as a sign of mourning, but as a symbol of honor. Death ceased to be a private tragedy and became a public sacrifice.
When the first setbacks arrived, patriotic duty turned into defensive fervor. After the defeat at Stalingrad
in 1943, the state did not inform the people of a retreat, but of a heroic sacrifice. Fallen soldiers were called eternal guardians of the East. Rather than sow doubt, the disaster reinforced the idea that the enemy was relentless and that the war was now a struggle for existence itself. In factories, women repeated that every bullet produced could avenge a lost son or husband.
In
schools, children were instructed in defensive tactics with sticks and fake hand grenades.
The war was no longer a
hope for glory, but a shield against annihilation. The war penetrated the intimacy of homes.
Families dined with maps on the table marking troop positions.
Every radio bulletin was listened to with tension.
There was no emotional escape. The front was in every living room. Civilians experienced the conflict as if they were soldiers,
convinced that the fate of the Reich depended on their sacrifice. Even when Allied bombings destroyed entire neighborhoods, many Germans claimed that the pain was proof they were right.
An elderly man recounted, "I would rather see my house burn than have all of Germany burn in shame."
In the last months of the war, when collapse was
imminent, patriotic duty reached its most radical form. 14-year-old children were sent to the front with anti-tank grenade launchers. Women over 60 dug trenches.
Civil officials established
local defense committees. The fight was no longer for the Führer, but to prevent chaos.
The state had convinced many that
defeat would mean the end of Germany as a nation. Until the last day when Soviet troops entered Berlin, citizens hung hand-painted signs saying, "Resistance is life."
The war, which had begun as a
promise of greatness, ended as an existential duty.
For millions of Germans, it was not a military campaign, but a spiritual battle fought in the name of a people who believed they were defending not only their territory, but
their place in history and the world. The knowledge of the Holocaust. When the first Jews began to disappear from German neighborhoods, there were no official announcements and no public farewells.
The shutters were found closed in the morning, shops shuttered, furniture piled in the streets.
These were not noisy arrests, but silent absences. Propaganda spoke of resettlements in the East and of work for the war effort. Millions of Germans heard those words without asking for details. For many, it was not necessary to know more. The state was acting and the people trusted. The unknown was not a mystery to be solved, but a moral burden to be kept at a distance. The deportations were visible. Trains left from central stations loaded with men, women, and children. Neighbors saw Jews walking toward the wagons escorted by German police or by the SS. In some towns, silent crowds gathered. There were no shouts or protests, nor celebrations, only a tense acceptance. Silence did not mean ignorance. It meant passive agreement. In letters intercepted by censorship, a civilian wrote, "They are being sent to work where those people belong. Better not to talk about it." The phrase sums up a general attitude to know without acknowledging, to accept without taking part, to look without seeing. The idea that Jews were not being killed, but relocated was a central element of the official narrative. At the same time, rumors circulated. Soldiers on leave spoke of mass shootings in Poland, of mass graves near Minsk, of trains returning empty. Some spoke in low voices. Others fell silent abruptly when they noticed unfamiliar looks. In taverns, people commented that the Jews will not return. Yet the majority of those who heard those rumors did not discuss them. It was not prudent to ask. The fear of the Gestapo mixed with the ideological conviction that the fate of the German people required extreme measures. In villages near concentration camps, the truth was impossible to ignore. The ovens worked at night and columns of smoke rose constantly. The smell of burning flesh permeated the air. Civilians saw columns of prisoners march toward the camp and did not see them again. Some farmers reported finding ashes in neighboring fields after the wind. Trains loaded with confiscated clothing arrived regularly at state warehouses. The visual evidence was present, but the German citizens' mind had been trained to translate the obvious into justified narratives. Those prisoners were enemies of the state. It was a war for survival. The enemy had to be eliminated so that the people could live. Knowledge of the Holocaust was not binary. It was not a matter of knowing or not knowing, but of accepting different levels of moral comprehension. There were those who knew clearly and supported actively convinced that the elimination of the Jew was necessary. There were those who suspected perceived signs, heard rumors, and although part of their conscience was disturbed, chose to silence it so as not to oppose the fate of the people. And there were even those who did not want to know. The phrase, "if it is for Germany's good, I don't need details," appears in multiple personal diaries. The media reinforced this attitude. Propaganda portrayed Jews as carriers of disease, comparing them to plagues or parasites. It was asserted that just as the peasant eliminates rats to protect the grain, the state had to remove those who threatened the life of the people. This biological analogy transformed mass murder into a hygienic act. It was not an atrocity. It was a treatment. When they heard about special actions in the East, many Germans did not think of shootings or gas chambers, but of sanitary measures. Language had dehumanized the enemy before physically eliminating him. On the trains, railway, workers saw sealed wagons loaded with entire families. Some heard screams from inside. They knew the fate was fatal. But they did not discuss it. The patriotic duty was to comply. In later testimonies, many railway workers said they did not feel they were transporting people, but state cargo. The process of dehumanization affected not only perception, but everyday language. Jews were not seen as deported citizens, but as an administrative category to be removed from the national fabric.
Some civilians were invited to witness public
executions in the East. SS officers showed mass graves to civilian delegations to demonstrate the power of the Reich.
These scenes did not generate horror but obedience.
Some spectators
wept not for the victims but for the moral weight of the German mission.
The belief that the enemy was a mortal threat justified any action. The logic was clear. If they did not disappear, Germany would disappear. As the war progressed, rumors turned into knowledge.
News of the massacres reached homes through soldiers on leave.
Some
soldiers reported that they had shot women and children.
Others spoke of trains arriving at camps where prisoners
were stripped and taken to shower rooms from which no one emerged alive.
In many letters, the soldiers tried to justify
their actions by saying they were following orders from superiors, that the enemy did not deserve mercy or that
it was a different kind of war. Families received these letters and kept them in silence. No one reported anything, no one questioned.
By 1943, with the war turning unfavorable for Germany, stories of Allied revenge began to circulate.
It was said that if Germany lost, Jews and Soviets would destroy the German nation without mercy. This fear reinforced the acceptance of extermination as a preventive act. Even those beginning to
understand the magnitude of what was happening preferred that the regime continue the war rather than face reprisals. For many, the Holocaust became the reason why the war could not end in surrender.
Inside the Reich,
property confiscated from Jews was distributed among the population. Clothes, furniture, jewelry, books, and works of art appeared in state stores.
Families bought these goods at low cost. They did not ask where they came from. The regime did not hide the origin.
The goods were part of the effort of the people. Thus, the German population became a direct beneficiary of the extermination process.
Looting was not
perceived as theft, but as historical justice.
When concentration camps began
to be liberated by the Allies in 1944 and 1945, many nearby civilians were forced to walk among corpses. Some claimed they had never known what was happening. Others lowered their gaze. Allied reports mention farmers who, upon seeing the bodies, murmured, "If the Führer ordered it, he must have had his
reasons."
The emotional impact of the Eastern Front.
When the German army crossed the border into the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, millions of soldiers were
convinced they were marching toward an inevitable victory.
Propaganda had presented Operation
Barbarossa as a crusade to free Europe from Bolshevism. Many soldiers believed they would return home before winter. However, the Eastern Front offered no glory, only a reality that would forever destroy the heroic perception of war. The vast territory, extreme climate, ferocity of the Soviet enemy, and brutality of the orders received transformed the military experience into a struggle for physical and psychological survival.
The first week saw rapid advances.
Villages burned, entire columns of the Red Army were encircled. But very soon the war took on
a different character. German soldiers began finding villages burned by their own inhabitants before retreating.
Poisoned wells, animals sacrificed to prevent falling into German hands.
The enemy refused to surrender.
Propaganda had depicted the Soviet as a primitive and weak being.
But on the Eastern
Front, soldiers discovered an adversary willing to fight to the death. The idea of a swift campaign collapsed in the face of resistance that did not follow traditional military logic, but rather a visceral hatred fueled by the desire to
survive at any cost.
The winter of 1941 marked the ultimate emotional
transformation.
Temperatures fell below 30 degrees below zero.
Tank engines froze.
Rifles wouldn't fire.
Soldiers lost fingers to frostbite while sleeping in makeshift trenches. In censored letters, Sent to their families, many wrote about comrades dying in their sleep. One soldier noted, "The silence of the front is not peace. It is death waiting." Units began to collapse internally.
Victory was no longer spoken of, only
resistance.
Nature became as much an enemy as the Soviet army. In the forests, partisans ambushed German
convoys. Isolated shots were heard at night. Roads became traps. Soldiers began feeling surrounded even in officially occupied territories. The sense of control vanished. The war ceased to be a campaign of expansion and became an experience of constant fear. The enemy was everywhere, even among civilians who smiled by day and shot by night. The emotional collapse intensified due to the orders received.
The soldiers were not only fighting the Soviet army, but were also participating in mass executions of Jews and communist
commissars.
Some did it convinced of their ideological duty, others out of fear of disobedience, but all bore the
weight of what they witnessed.
In the personal diaries found after the war, many soldiers described scenes of mass
graves, of trucks unloading women and children. A captain wrote, "I can't sleep. I believe in nothing anymore, but I continue to obey." The war, which had begun as a sacred mission, turned into a descent into dehumanization. Every Soviet refusal to surrender reinforced German harshness.
Battles turned into mutual massacres.
Soldiers
began to perceive the war as a struggle for existence.
They did not fight to conquer, but to avoid being destroyed.
When the Red Army launched its counteroffensive in the winter of 1941, the myth of German invincibility
disappeared.
Soldiers retreated west under enemy fire, leaving behind thousands of frozen corpses.
Entire detachments were annihilated.
Casualties were no longer numbers, but comrades whose bodies were left abandoned in the
snow, slowly covered by the icy wind.
The arrival of new troops from Germany
showed a brutal contrast.
Young recruits, arriving optimistic, encountered silent veterans with empty
stares. The Führer was no longer spoken of during nights in the bunkers.
There were no songs, no speeches.
There was silence. Older soldiers avoided talking about combat. The war broke minds before bodies.
Some began writing letters they never sent, telling the truth they knew was forbidden.
They did not fight for the homeland, but to survive another day.
Over time, the perception of the enemy changed.
The Soviets stopped being seen as inferior and became an unstoppable force. In hand-to-hand combat in Stalingrad, Germans fought room by room with bayonets.
The Eastern Front was reduced to meters of contested territory where every broken wall was a
potential grave.
The streets were covered with frozen bodies. Buildings turned into black skeletons.
The city became a symbol of mutual suffering. Neither side retreated. Every German soldier in Stalingrad understood he no
longer fought for victory, but to avoid dying abandoned in an icy basement.
The
German army, used to rapid advances, had to face an unknown reality: prolonged defeat.
Units were surrounded without ammunition or food.
Soldiers fed on dead horses on the soles of their boots.
Some accounts describe soldiers collecting
snow mixed with blood to melt and drink. The war had ceased to have a strategic or ideological purpose.
It had become a
personal test of endurance against nothingness.
Soldiers who managed to return to Germany on leave did not recognize their home.
The warmth of stoves, the calm of the streets, and the smiles of children seemed foreign to
them.
In many families, veterans remained silent during meals, unable to recount what they had seen.
Mothers avoided asking.
The Eastern Front was not a glorious story.
It was a spiritual void that marked anyone who went through it forever.
The war had ceased to be a patriotic duty and had become an open wound in the German soul.
As the Red Army advanced into German territory, fear turned into despair. Soldiers knew the enemy would show no mercy. Many units fought not out of ideological obedience, but out of fear of retaliation. The Eastern Front did not just destroy bodies. It destroyed faith in war itself. It had begun as an ideological crusade and ended as a collective nightmare in which every day of life was a personal victory against the abyss. Blind faith in the face of collapse. At the beginning of 1944, as the Allied armies advanced inexorably from the west and the Red Army surged from the east, the German population began to face a profound emotional contradiction. Cities burned under the bombings. Trains filled with the wounded arrived endlessly. Battlefields devoured entire divisions. Yet, instead of surrendering to the evidence of collapse, many Germans clung even more strongly to the belief that the Führer had a secret plan, that a miracle weapon would change the course of the war. This hope did not arise from reason, but from an inner need not to accept that all sacrifices, such as the dead, the ruins, and the spilled blood had been in vain. In radio broadcast speeches, Adolf Hitler assured that Germany was on the verge of a decisive change. He spoke of new technologies, rockets capable of destroying London in minutes, invincible jet planes. Every word was carefully crafted to keep fanaticism alive. Joseph Goebbels reinforced this narrative with his call for total war, proclaiming that only the people willing to sacrifice without reserve deserved to survive in history. Radio broadcasts ended with the phrase, "Victory will be ours," even when there were no longer enough armies to defend the borders. In factories, workers listened to these messages while the bombings made the walls tremble. Some accounts mention workers raising their heads with determination when the V2 weapons were mentioned, as if German science were the tangible manifestation of national destiny. In the streets, leaflets read, "If we hold on a little longer, the world will see the power of German genius." Propaganda did not deny the bombings or defeats, but presented them as part of the process before the final resurgence. It was the last act of faith of a people no longer fighting to conquer, but to avoid falling into darkness. Many civilians feared what would happen if Germany surrendered. Rumors of Soviet reprisals fueled collective terror. In towns near the Eastern Front, stories circulated of razed villages and raped women. These reports did not weaken faith in victory. They intensified it. For millions of Germans, surrender was not an option. Not out of ideological loyalty, but out of fear of extermination. The war was no longer fought for Hitler or the Reich, but for personal survival. Propaganda skillfully exploited that fear, ensuring that only victory or death could guarantee the preservation of the people. In the last months of the war, the Folkam was formed, a militia made up of 14-year-old boys and 60-year-old men. They were given outdated rifles, defective bazookas, and promises of glory. Some of these children, like Hans Krebs from Berlin, marched convinced that they would witness the final miracle. Instructors told them that the Führer possessed a secret weapon capable of wiping out the Allied armies in a matter of days. Faith in the Führer did not weaken with defeat. In some sectors, it turned into apocalyptic fervor. The idea that the ultimate sacrifice would seal German greatness penetrated public speeches and households. Meanwhile, entire families prayed for divine intervention in air raid shelters. Some believed Hitler was an instrument of God. Others saw him as a man destined to suffer to save his people. Even when speeches became inconsistent and the Führer's voice sounded shaky on the radio, the belief persisted. In a diary written during the last days of Berlin, a woman noted, "If we fall, at least we will fall fighting. The Führer will not abandon us. Germany will rise from our ruins." This phrase reflected a widespread mentality. Accepting defeat was equivalent to betraying the meaning of German history.
The SS maintained fanaticism brutally.
Officers executed any soldier who spoke of surrender.
In towns, the Gestapo hung posters with the names of defeatist traitors.
Entire families could be shot for listening to foreign broadcasts or expressing doubts about victory.
Faith was no longer
voluntary. It was mandatory. Yet many continued to believe sincerely. Fanaticism mixed with terror, creating a desperate devotion.
Believing became the only way to endure the unbearable.
Hitler, confined in his bunker,
continued issuing orders to units that no longer existed. Military situation maps became symbols of a parallel
reality.
Generals reported that no divisions were available, no fuel, no troops.
Hitler responded that victory depended on faith, not resources.
Inside the Reich, radios repeated that the
enemy will be expelled at the gates of Berlin. While bombs fell on the capital, the
Führer's voice continued speaking of a final counterattack. For many Germans, the inevitable fall did not bring
clarity, only more darkness.
The idea of total collapse became a spiritual test. Some civilians wrote that if the Reich were to perish, then the world did not deserve to exist.
This mentality led
many to destroy their own homes before allowing them to fall into enemy hands. The burning of entire cities was not
seen as defeat, but as an act of purification. Faith in victory transformed into faith in sacrifice. In
the final days of the war, with the enemy already advancing through the streets of Berlin, citizens still raised
Reich flags over smoking ruins.
They did not do it to intimidate the enemy, but
to assert their identity in the face of chaos. In some neighborhoods, voices could be heard shouting, "The Führer lives."
Even though his death had already been confirmed, faith had not disappeared.
It had become delirium. The German people did not surrender intellectually.
They surrendered physically when there were no weapons. No houses, no cities, no roads left. Faith was not defeated by evidence, but
by the impossibility of continuing to breathe under the rubble. Dreyfus and the feeling of collective guilt.
In May 1945, when the gunfire finally ceased, Germany ceased to exist as a nation and became a moral and material ruin.
The cities were skeletons of stone. The
roads were covered with refugees.
The defeated soldiers wandered aimlessly.
On the faces of the population, there was neither rage nor relief, only deep confusion. For years, they had believed in victory, in the Führer, in the
historical destiny of the German people.
Suddenly, everything collapsed.
The subsequent silence was so overwhelming
that many did not understand whether the war had ended or whether the world had simply stopped.
When Allied troops began
to liberate the concentration camps, German civilians were forced to see what their government had hidden or what they
had decided not to see.
In cities near Dau, Kenwald, or Bergen-Belsen, American and British officers gathered the neighbors and made them walk among the stacked corpses.
Some covered their faces, others cried.
A woman from Weimar shouted, "We knew nothing of this," while the soldiers forced her to keep
walking.
Photographs of those tours show astonished faces but also empty stares. The horror was not processed as guilt but as disbelief.
The myth of the innocent people began to be constructed. At that very moment, the Nuremberg trials began a few months later.
For the first time, the leaders of a state were judged not for treason or defeat but for crimes against humanity. In the German streets, the trials were observed with a
mixture of distance and fatigue.
Many considered it the justice of the victims.
Others, unable to accept the magnitude of the crime, preferred to see the accused as victims of fate. In letters and diaries of the time, the Same idea is repeated. We also suffered. That phrase became an emotional wall, preventing recognition of collective responsibility. All of Germany had been bombed. Millions of civilians had died. Entire cities had disappeared. One's own suffering served as a refuge from guilt. Denazification began immediately. Every citizen had to complete a form asking whether they had belonged to the party, the SS, or any of its organizations. Interrogations multiplied. Those who had held public office were removed. Thousands of teachers, police officers, and officials were removed from their positions. Factories changed hands. Books were censored. Symbols were banned. However, the process was uneven. In the Western zones, the Americans and British soon discovered that the reconstruction of the country required the same technicians, engineers, and administrators who had served the regime. Within a few years, many former party members quietly returned to administrative and industrial positions. Nazism disappeared from uniforms, but not from biographies. Collective guilt became a taboo subject. In cafes, no one spoke of the past. Conversations revolved around food, scarcity, reconstruction. Children asked about their missing parents and received evasive answers. The ruins were too visible to talk about. In churches, sermons asked for forgiveness, but without pointing out the guilty. In homes, the war was remembered only as shared suffering. Mothers spoke of the bombings of the dead children of hunger. The concentration camps were rarely mentioned. The phrase "no one knew anything" became the national mantra in the Soviet zone. Dazification took on a more brutal form. The purges were systematic and public humiliations were common. Thousands of Germans were sent to labor camps. Soviet propaganda did not seek reflection but punishment. In the East, guilt was not internalized. It was imposed by force. In the West, however, the Allied occupation relied on re-education. Documentary films showed Nazi crimes in cinemas. School children had to read victims' testimonies. Newspapers spoke of the moral error of the German people, but the impact was limited. Most viewed these images with horror, but without personal connection. The crimes were attributed to others, them, the leaders who had manipulated an innocent populace. Economic reconstruction gradually faded memory. With the Marshall Plan and the establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany, the focus shifted from the past to the future. Germans wanted to live again, to eat, to work, and, if possible, to forget. In the 1950s, trials dwindled, the convicted were released for good behavior, and the nation immersed itself in a moral rebuilding based on silence. Collective memory was reframed around the notion of shared suffering, Germany as a victim of the war, like any other nation. Amid this climate of denial, the first critical voices emerged. Intellectuals such as Karl Jaspers and Theodor Adorno began discussing the moral responsibility of the German people not as legal guilt, but as a spiritual obligation. Jaspers contended that even those who had not directly committed atrocities were culpable for having accepted life under a regime that perpetrated them. His ideas met resistance. Most were unwilling to shoulder that weight. The generation that had lived under the regime perceived the past as an alien nightmare, something imposed by the victors. Yet, the post-war-born youth began to question. In the 1960s, as Germany regained economic stability, a generational confrontation unfolded. Children interrogated their parents about their actions between 1933 and 1945. Many discovered that their teachers, doctors, or local officials had been Nazis. Family photographs concealed uniforms, insignias, and pledges. It was at this moment that the nation began to confront itself in the mirror. Guilt stopped being abstract and became personal history. Denazification was never complete, but it gradually reshaped German consciousness. The generation that had marched under the Reich's banners ended their lives in silence, caught between nostalgia and shame.
Their children grew up amidst rebuilt ruins and fragmented truths. In the following decades, Germany became a symbol of historical paradox, a people who had achieved the highest degree of obedience and later subjected themselves to the deepest moral scrutiny of their own identity. Even as the last ruins were cleared and new buildings covered the country's scars, the past did not vanish. It remained beneath the surface, invisible, awaiting remembrance.